All right, so I'm done with my warm-up. What's nice about it is it really kind of pushed my colors and really started building it up, because in a warm-up you shouldn't feel too constrained towards a finished vision, but it helps inform your finished vision. And if I feel like I pushed it too far color-wise, I could always take its opacity down and kind of blend it with what I was doing before. Maybe to about there, 73%. With digital, to me, it's always nice to see the different options. So, yeah, let's put it about 70. Let's do 77. And then, as I was doing my targeted painting underneath, especially with the eye, that's starting to really make a difference. So I'm going to keep that up until I feel like I'm ready to go to refined painting. And I'm not quite there yet because I don't have kind of a unifying light source yet. And so I'm going to keep looking at these different colors and squinting and seeing the different values they give me, like the 5 o'clock shadow he has. And I'm keeping my brush at about 80% opacity and trying to bring in color where I think it's appropriate and interesting. But also trying to keep the value in mind. Like how bright, how dark. And that can get tricky with all the color. So that's why we're going to play with opacity in our brush when we start refining it more. And you can use different resources. Now notice, different sources I might steal from have very different light sources. If I want to use more of these yellows in the nose, for instance, or more of these pinks, I'll make sure I shape the highlights correctly. But I'm going to choose them for their light value. I just hold down Option to steal the color. And I can always steal from myself, which helps to blend them a bit. And the more you kind of layer up, as long as you're keeping the big picture in mind, the more you layer up your different brush strokes, the more complexity you're adding, the more satisfying it will look close up as a paint surface. Because by painting at a slightly low opacity, 80% in this case, you can see all those colors kind of come through. This is like a watercolor approach. Painting with slight transparency. Unlike watercolor, we can paint the whites on top. We can paint highlights on top of shadows. Till we find the right solutions. And because James Baldwin is this older gentleman, I don't need to worry so much about keeping his skin really smooth or refining it. But even if I were doing a young model or starlet or something, I wouldn't worry about that too much. I'd smooth it at the end. Trying to get layers of complexity built up right now. And all the time you're kind of visually measuring with what you're doing. And you'll notice when certain things feel out of place, like his lower lip being too small, I need to push that out. just needing to come in. And all of those are adjustments that can be made. The shadow above the eyelid being darker. Placement of the eyebrow. And the lightening of the shape underneath it. And then we have what's called reflected light on the back of things, like the back of his jaw. It's brighter back there. Tuck some of that reflected light in. And then you don't want to ignore things like the neck. The back of the head, the less interesting parts, the ear. Though we probably won't have time to really finish off our digital painting to its most finished state within the parameters of this class because it's due next class. What we try to do is have a finish overall, which means that all parts of it feel treated and worked on to about the same level. So now I can do the highlight of that lower eyelid. It goes right after the shadow. I'll give it some dimension. And some of my strokes are going underneath my warm-up paint layers, but because I turn that opacity down, I can see kind of how they all work a little bit better now. And so that red stays there because it's on my warm-up layer, but I can paint these bluish shadows underneath. Deepen the value. Don't want to be wimpy about the values you paint. And once I feel like too much of it has been covered up, then I'll start going for a new paint layer that's more refined on top. I think I'm about there. Some of these highlights have no place where they are. I need to change that. So put a little bit more color in the ear here. Try to establish darkest darks within each area that you're painting. You're not afraid to go push those values. Now I have red everywhere except in the hair, so I feel like I need to put a little bit in there too. Again, so that every part feels as considered as every other. That's the kind of finish I'm going for. Okay, now I don't keep much of the collar in the shirt, but I might as well try to bring that up as well. And by stealing the colors, instead of just painting, by finding my own colors, I can get more interesting variations. And it's all about shape. So much of what we do as digital artists comes down to the shapes we use. I just want to suggest the shoulders without having to really paint much. The focus is on the face. All right, now what I can do is I can go back to my rough sketch, and now I'm going to change tools, which I don't often do. So I'm going to change to the eraser. I'm going to keep it on the same brush, my brush, keep it at 100% opacity, and still pretty large. And now I'm going to cut back. Now I've worked with my piece long enough kind of know where some of the alterations need to be made to the outside shape, collar. ear. And this is when you need the eraser, just to cut away from that. Kind of shape the face a little bit more, just to rebuild. It depends how much of a caricature you're going for. Okay, and then that's a good time to save it. I also want to try to keep the whole head on the canvas, so I'm going to not have that tangency at the edge where it feels awkward where it's touching. All right, let's save it there. And now I'm basically going to lock these layers from the rough sketch on up through the warm-up. Make a new layer and call this refined paint. Now all you really need is local color, local flat color, and then a layer on top where you are modulating values and colors and edges. But this kind of helps me to experiment and build it more slowly, as you see. And by having the navigator there, it kind of keeps everything working the way I want. All right, so now on my refined paint layer, I'm going to change my opacity down to about 70%. And I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller, from about 252 pixels to about 200 pixels. And the difference is now I'm going to paint on top of everything. All right, 200 pixel brush. But I'm going to do it in a more targeted way to really shape the form. And I will probably end up zooming in quite a bit. But first, let me take care of some of these highlights that shouldn't be here. Replace them with color. And now, instead of just painting and having fun with the brush, I'm going to try to use the brush in the direction of the skin. It's small enough, it's low enough opacity, I'm going to switch colors enough. That should help bring up some texture too. And this might be a time to visit my brush settings and maybe give it a little bit more texture within the brush itself. Probably turn off the wet edges. So it shows more of what's going on behind. And you work darkening and you work on the shadows, and then you also, of course, work on the highlights. You work both sides of the mid-tone gray that you have to bring about the image you want. It's just on this refined layer, you're painting over the top, letting things kind of blend together, working a little bit smaller. And I'm still resisting the urge to zoom in. Try to do as much as I can while seeing the whole picture together. That has a lot to do with the kind of finish I'm going for. See, the advantage of this is even if you pick something like that really dark, pretty much black, I think it's a dark blue though, that I'm using in the hair, it takes a while to build it up to be that black at 70% opacity with the texture built into the brush. So it's always going to be mixing with the other colors. And then when I put a highlight in, it too will take a while. To really overpower. So you only go to this refined layer once you're pretty happy with